This is how Prague looks like today. But don't you ever just wonder, how did it all happen? How did a small settlement become a bustling European capital? The city of 100 spires. In this video, we are gonna talk about how Prague was built. We are gonna trace the city development from its origins to the rich realities of today. And let's first travel back to the very end of the Iron Age, which will mainly help us with words, not so much with people. There isn't enough of evidence to suggest there was a large settlement in Vltava River Valley before our time, but sporadic archaeological findings from nearby areas tell us that Celts were hanging out here for a long time. The tribe in question was called Boi, hence the first name of this land, Bohemia. The name of the river has old origins as well. It comes from Germanic Vilth Ahwa, wild water. Let's now leave the Celts and move on to the people who made Prague their home, the Slavs. In the end of the 9th century, Bořivoj and Ludmila of Přemysl dynasty had decided to switch it up a little bit and moved from their seat at Levý Hradec to here, Prague Castle hill, and built the first ever stone structure in Prague there. It was a church of the Virgin Mary. It's not this one comes a little bit later. They had probably selected this location because it was a vantage point. It had some natural fortifications, such as this big canyon on the northern side of Prague Castle that we know as the Deer Moat. Plus, there was plenty of drinkable water and stone to build from. As the Přemysl dynasty had settled on the Prague Castle hill, more buildings had appeared there. For example, the Basilica of St. George, which is just deceiving us a little bit with its Baroque facade, and the old royal palace. The first Prague Castle looked something like this. Still not very impressive, right? The first ever mention of Prague comes from the end of the 10th century, when a Jewish Arab merchant called Ibrahim ibn Yaqub had traveled through here. He described Prague as the city made of stone, which is a big progress already, which had a castle and a market where they sold slaves. You might think that was the Old Town Square market, but you would be wrong. It was most likely the market right below the Prague Castle we now know as the Lesser Town Square. Despite the fame of Prague Castle, legends tell us that the most ancient place in Prague is Vyšehrad, a cradle of Czech nation where a mythical ruler, Krok, had settled with his tribe in the early centuries of our time. Historians are convinced, though, that Vyšehrad comes from around 950, and even though it is no doubt a remarkable site, it is not as old as the stories want us to believe. The area that appeared on the map next, which ironically sounds like it was the baseline of everything, was the Old Town. Yeah, Old Town is actually not the oldest thing in Prague. It started to take its shape somewhere between Ibrahim ibn Yaqub's journey to Prague and 1108. By 1108, we know there was already a market square here that we now know as the Old Town Square. The market in the Old Town was so popular, the king decided to cash in on that lucrative opportunity and created Ungeld, which is this little yard very close to the Old Town Square. This was an area where foreign merchants were obliged to stop by to weigh and tax all of their goods. It was like a fortress inside of the city. It was royally protected, and this is where they were collecting the money from all those foreigners coming in. They still do that in the form of overpriced beer. What furthered the development of the trading route through Prague was building of a new stone bridge. Not this one. This one. It was called Judith Bridge, named after the wife of Vladislav II, the king at that time. There were probably wooden predecessors to Judith Bridge, and if you are wondering how people would cross Vltava River back in the day, they would do it through a shallow point in the river located approximately where Manes Bridge is nowadays. But that was inconvenient and wet. Speaking of water, Prague had a lot of problems because of Vltava. This river used to flood Prague quite a lot, even up until recently in 2002 and 2013. It became even worse after they built the weirs. Floods pretty much became constant, and they had to raise the original ground level of Prague by 3 to 5 meters. We talked about it in this video. We will link it in the description box. Anyone who has been to the Old Town can testify that it's a maze of narrow streets, passages, and alleyways where even locals have to use navigation at times. It is truly a medieval city at heart because parts of that urban area were not planned, they were not built on some kind of grid, they appeared organically. In fact, Old Town only became a town in 1235 when King Wenceslas I decided to unite the small settlements and surround them with a defense wall and a moat. Not much survived from that medieval fortification nowadays, except the name of the street where the moat used to be located, na Příkopě, as well as part of the bridge that would connect the Old Town with the outside world. Another important addition to 13th century Prague was the Jewish quarter that was introduced after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, when all Jewish subjects were stripped away from their rights and moved to the right riverbank corner, separated from the rest of the city by the wall and gates. They were not allowed to leave the Jewish quarter unless they had a special permission, and even then they had to wear a symbol that would help the Christian population to distinguish them from the crowd. Charles IV, Bohemian king and Holy Roman Emperor, had ascended the throne. Charles IV had loads of plans for his hometown, starting from rebuilding his royal residence in Prague Castle and Vyšehrad. St. Vitus Cathedral had started to be built during the reign of Charles IV. He also established the first Central European University and built an iconic stone bridge that stood the test of time. But perhaps the most ambitious endeavor of the emperor was construction of the new town. In 1348, Charles IV had began his large urban project by expanding the city of Prague. He added a whole new district to the capital called the New Town. Back in the day, they were not very inventive when it came to names, I'm afraid. He extended the city by a 3.6-kilometer long defense wall that I'm standing next to right now, even though it looks like I'm in some dodgy place. I don't know if I would recommend coming here at night. Probably not. Charles IV also introduced 3 new markets to that area. Charles Square, which back then was the cattle market, Wenceslas Square, back then horse market, and Haymarket closer to the main station. But it wasn't just because of business that the new town was established. There was also, let's say, wishful thinking behind it. Charles IV believed that Prague would become the place where the second coming of Christ will happen. Let that sink in. So he also built a lot of churches in the new town to hit the nail on the head, so to speak. The apocalypse never came, thankfully, but there was a silver lining to that. Prague became third largest city in medieval Europe and essentially peaked. This was the golden age of Prague. After Charles IV died, his beloved country was dragged into multiple aristocratic skirmishes and military conflicts. When we look at the map of Prague through centuries, we don't see much development up until 1900. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Honestly, it's a miracle that Prague even survived all of these military conflicts and natural disasters. But besides all of that, there was something else. There was a more sinister reason why Prague wasn't allowed to develop. The Habsburgs. Yes, the Austrian royal family that took over Czech throne in 1526. Here is one of their last symbols, which was not torn down after the establishment of Czechoslovakia, and there's a little rhyme Czech people wrote about it. Round and round goes Czech pride with an idiot inside. As you can guess, Habsburgs were not liked very much. There were some exceptions, like Rudolf II, but otherwise Czech people just wanted their autonomy. So much so that in 1618 they threw out, aka defenestrated, representatives of the Habsburg crown and started one of the bloodiest military conflicts in European history, called 30 Years' War. They also elected their own Protestant king. Habsburgs did not like it very much, and then a bunch of people were executed and even a bigger bunch expelled from the imperial lands. From then on, people had to keep it on the low, pray in Catholic churches, and don't get involved in any kind of rebellions. And Prague, well, Prague was not allowed to be bigger than Vienna. It had to be a provincial town, banished from big talks and decisions. Just to emphasize how very little the map of Prague was altered till the 19th century, the second Prague Bridge was only constructed constructed in 1841, almost 500 years after Charles Bridge. It was a much needed change for Prague as the traffic was already quite heavy and other bridges followed suit. The next big urban project came in the second half of the 19th century, and it was called Sanitization. First of all, what does it mean? I'm sure you guys know how the streets of Paris look like. Beautiful Art Nouveau buildings, wide boulevards, iconic. But what if I told you Paris did not always look like that? In fact, it was quite shabby up until they decided to tear all those bad-looking buildings down and replace them with the new ones. This is what sanitization was, essentially. And they wanted to do the same in Prague. There were a few candidates. One of them was the former Jewish quarter. Why former? I haven't told you guys yet, but in around 1782, the Emperor Joseph II finally freed Jewish people from the Jewish quarter. With most of the Jewish people leaving the Jewish quarter, a lot of criminal elements moved in here. There were a lot of brothels. It just became a dodgy area right next to the Old Town Square, which was not a good look. So they decided to sanitize it. So what they did, they destroyed most of these older buildings and replaced them with beautiful Art Nouveau apartment houses. And this is what a lot of people admire when they come to Prague. But from the modern standpoint, that was of course a controversial thing to do. Nowadays we prefer to preserve the old architecture, but back then they had a different opinion. In fact, the first sanitization plan was much more brutal. They wanted to bulldozer through the Old Town Square to create a wide boulevard that would connect Czech Bridge with Wenceslas Square. Thank God they stopped at Perry Street. 1918, right after the end of the First World War, Prague became the capital of the newly established sovereign Czechoslovakian state. Hooray! And it could finally be bigger than Vienna. So they worked out a new plan on the expansion of Prague that was called Velká Praha, literally Big Prague or Great Prague. When in 1922 they added 37 new municipalities to the city of Prague. Essentially all of these suburbs that started to appear around the city center and further were added to the city. So places like Vinohrady, Žižkov, Smíchov and other neighborhoods that we visited on our channel were added to the city of Prague and they became one large city. Prague expanded to about 776,000 inhabitants and 171 square kilometers. Prague was lucky, unlike other major cities during Second World War. There were still bombings, but they were not as frequent. The biggest one was called Valentine's Day bombing because it happened on 14th of February 1945. And it was done by American Air Forces. We made a whole video about it. I will leave it in the description box. The communist times also brought some changes to the city. Mainly a pretty good metro system, some questionable roads, and a lot more of these. We visited a typical communist suburb in our video about Jižní Město. We will link it down below. You can guys check it out. Communists had a plan to make Prague a 1 million people city, and they achieved that. Nowadays, it is 1.3 million and it inflates by 300,000 more daily because of all the people who get to Prague to work. The current city of Prague is about 496 square kilometers large. It is one of the most expensive European capitals as well as one of the most beautiful ones, but I might be biased. Thank you so much guys for watching this video. Let us know in the comments what fact about Prague you found the most surprising and we will see you in our next one. Bye!